So this meeting is now being recorded. This meeting is a regular Zoom meeting. It's not a webinar format, which we had in the September 1st version of the presentation about the adopted budget. And in fact, during that forum, there were more comments about the forum as opposed to the content of the presentation. And so we want to hear from you. We want to get your thoughts on the proposed budget. So we are using a regular Zoom meeting approach. What that means is that everybody's mic can be turned on or not. So the ground rules are, please mute yourself unless you wish to speak. Please, everybody mute yourself so that we don't get that kind of background noise and distractions while we're meeting. The second thing is, please raise your hand when you would like to speak or ask a question or make a comment. For those of you who aren't very familiar with Zoom, if you go to the controls at the bottom, there's a button that says reactions. Within the reactions, there's a raise hand feature, and you can click that, and that'll put a little symbol of a hand in on your screen. And so that we can call on you and you can express your thoughts. We've got plenty of time scheduled today. We've reserved 2 hours for this presentation. I hope it doesn't go that long, but we are committed to answering your questions and getting your input today. We are approaching this in good faith. We really want to have an honest, transparent conversation with the community, which is one of the other reasons why we are having a regular Zoom meeting format. 45. So with that, I will turn it over. I'm going to mute Shirley. Okay. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chancellor Jackson. So over to you, Dr. J.
All right, thank you very much. And thank to those of you that are attending this meeting. I think it's very important for us to try to get the brightest and the best ideas out to the board. And so please keep that in mind as we go through this. That is what the intent is. It's not to poke fingers or to point out blame. We are where we are right now. And that's the reason that we went with a forum versus having a webinar. But when you have a forum, which is what we're having right now, that means that people can use the chat, people can use a Q&A, people can raise their hands. And so I'm asking staff, all district office staff, to help in those efforts. Because when we tried this once before, it was very confusing because some people were putting questions in Q&A, other people were putting them in chat. So then we also had the live conversations going on. So it was, I don't want it to be like that today. Please use the hand raise feature. If you have a question, if you want to make a comment, please make it an honest comment, not a snarky comment about you don't like the way that Mark Johnson has let his hair get cut and now it's growing long again. We want to keep on topic. So I say that as a joke, but I really do mean it. The things that we're going to talk about today are things that we've already presented in a couple of different forums, but we still wanted to give another chance for input. This is something that came up at the last board meeting on Tuesday of this week. And so we were planning on having our PBIM summit during this time frame, and we decided to move that and reschedule it. We're looking at October the 7th. You'll get more information, but the documents are out there already posted. The agenda is posted. The Zoom link now has been updated. And we are using, for those of you that don't know, we are using board docs for all of the district-wide committees this year. so that other individuals who are not committee members can have access to the resource documents. In the past, we had them out on Teams, and because they were on Teams, only certain individuals that were members of that team had access. So that is now being put out in board docs. And if you go up to the upper right-hand corner and use the drop down, you can select the district-wide committee that you want to access their documents. And so the PGC, that information is out there. So just wanted to remind you of that. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to have Dr. Jones, Nathaniel Jones III, who is the acting vice chancellor for finance and administration, make the presentation that he did to the board on Tuesday. He's going to truncate it down. For those of you that want more information, you can go to board docs and you can download it yourself. It's going to be the same document, but he's going to focus on certain areas. And the areas that he's going to focus on are the ones where we came up with options. We said, here are some options, and we made some blocks of data options for the board. And then we made a recommendation, two recommendations based upon the options that we at the district office are looking at. So we want comment on both of those. If there's a box, so to speak, that we missed out on, please let us know. If there's an option that you are recommending, let's look at those. And to make it in a broad way to try to come up with some kind of consensus so that when I present it to the board, I can say these were the items that were recommended, or to take a term that's used by IEPI, here's a menu of options. The board can select one, two, they can take two, combine them, and they can also come up with options that are not even listed. But we're hoping to provide that input to the board so that when we have our next meeting on the 27th, that we actually have a menu of options, viable options with recommendations. Some may have more consensus than others, but we will present that to the board on their next regularly scheduled meeting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jones. And then the rest of the meeting will be for questions, input, and please make them thoughtful, not specious, things that we know we aren't going to do just for effect. But really, we're trying to do this so that we do solicit your input, because I think more than 6 minds, which is kind of who put the recommendations together, are better than just one. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jones so that he can make the presentation, and we will then be open for input. And again, this document is available in board docs at the last board meeting, which was on the 13th, I believe it was. Okay, go ahead, Nathaniel.
Okay, Chancellor, give me 1 second. Let me locate the right document. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Chancellor, for the introduction. And everyone, thank you for taking time out of your afternoon to attend this forum. As the Chancellor indicated, I'm going to go over the presentation that I made to the board last Tuesday. I'm going to focus on a few slides that pertain largely to the menu of options for addressing the challenge that we have relative to the revenue overstatement. So I'm going to touch on a couple of slides very quickly. So just as a recap, we got about $4.4 billion more in Prop 98 funding. The lion's share of it was one-time funding rather than ongoing, but we got 1.9 billion in ongoing funding. So the other thing that I wanted to share is let's look focus, since the issue that pertains to our budget challenge is with regard to the ongoing funding. So let's focus there. So if we look at that, we'll see that we got funding from the state in terms of COLA, but there was also a huge amount of money that was provided by the state for the student-centered funding formula base increase. That's significant because that's also the place that really caused the error that occurred, because it was a misunderstanding of how that should be appropriately calculated and factored into the determination of our total apportionment revenue or total computational revenues that we receive as a district. So I think it's helpful to recognize that things had been very fluid and that there were, in the end of August, some really new information coming to light that occurred in a relatively short time frame. The document, the governor signed the budget bill to the end of June, early July. And then I think it was around the middle of July, we got what we call the joint analysis by the league and ACBO and ACA that basically highlighted and summarized the resources that we were getting under the budget act. So then, about a month later, we got a new document from the state that actually showed slightly different rates that had occurred since the enactment of the budget, and that was summarized in the joint analysis that we had received in July. So as part of our process where we were sending the budget information to the printers to get that prepared and ready to give to the board, we were doing our final, validation and review. And it was during that process that we discovered the error in terms of calculating the revenue. And that occurred on or about the 26th of August. And so then we had the town hall, we shared information about what the error was and how it occurred. And then on August the 30th, we received a summary from the state that validated the fact that there was an error because the newly calculated revenues that we had calculated matched exactly what was in this schedule from the state. And so I'm going to go to that right now. So on the 30th, we get this schedule that came from the state that shows all the apportionment revenues for each district. And if you can see down here in yellow, very lightly there, we show 136,171,044 as the revenue for the Peralta Community College District. So the calculation error came with regard to the hold harmless. In a nutshell, what was done was the hold harmless was calculated thinking that it would be calculated with the same kind of percent increase that was associated with the additional funding that was part of the student-centered funding formula base increase. In fact, and then that was then added to the calculated TCR under the student-centered funding form. So this number here was then added to this number, and that gave us $147,836,926 as the revenue. That was a misunderstanding of how to treat that additional revenue. In fact, the way the revenue should have been and then subsequently was calculated correctly was based on the methodology that I'm going to share with you right now. The state allows us to have the higher of the revenue when the revenue is calculated based on 3 different methodologies. The first one is under the student-centered funding formula. You take the 70, 30, 70, 20, 10, 70% coming from the FTS largely in 2 components, FTS times a rate, and then the other one is FTS based on the overall FTS for your institution, large, small, medium. And then the other components would be the supplemental and the student success. Supplemental is about the number of students that are AB 540 or receiving Pell for the low income students. And then the others is a myriad of success measures. And so that's the student-centered funding formula. So you run through those numbers there, come up with a value. And this is the data from 21, 22. Similar, there's a stability calculation, which basically said, take your last year's student-centered funding formula calculation and adjust it by the current year's COLA. And so that was done, produced 113,311. And then the hold harmless. Hold harmless calculation is basically to take the 17-18 total computational revenue and escalated by the approved COLA from 18-19 forward until the current year, which the current year's COLA is 6.56%. And so when they do that calculation, now you have 3 different values of total computational revenue. And so the max TCR is the greatest of these. And so in this case, it was the hold harmless. For us, it's been the hold harmless since the introduction of the student-centered funding formula. And so the hold harmless amount is actually correctly calculated by taking the max TCR and subtracting out the revenue that is determined by the student-centered funding formula. So when you do that, you get a difference of 18.71. All right, so now that that's understood, so using the same exact methodology, we calculate the 3 revenues based on the 3 different methods. And so what we did was calculated our revenues based on the student-centered funding formula, came up with $129.6 million. Used the stability calculation, came up with revenues there of $116.2 million. Similarly, did the hold harmless calculation, came up with revenues of $136.17 million. Obviously, the 136 is the highest. That's our total computational revenue. So when calculating how much the hold harmless would be, we do the same thing, subtract the student-centered funding formula from the max TCR of 136, and that gives us an actual hold harmless value of $6.56 million, rather than the $21 million that was included in the budget previously. That was where the error came in. So we had a proposed adopted budget in terms of revenues of $147.86 million, when in fact it should have been $136.17 million, a difference of $11.665 million. So And so that was the challenge, is that the adopted budget stated that our apportionment revenues would be $147 million rather than 136. However, what I want to be really, really clear about is we didn't lose any money. We were only going to get $136 million. It's not like it's a cut. So I want to be really clear about that. We're not getting less money than we should have, and we're dealing with a budget cut. No, in fact, we are getting additional revenues. If you look at last year's TCR, it was 127.709. This year it's 136.171. So we are getting the right amount of revenue, and it's more than we got last year. The difference is we thought incorrectly that it would be even much higher. And so what we are doing is bringing things back to a level that aligns with our actual revenues that we're going to be receiving. And so in trying to look at how we might deal with making that reduction, we came up with a menu of options. I'm going to pause. I see the Chancellor. Are you wanting to jump in here?
I did want to just say a couple of things. The first is I want to make sure everyone understands the calculations that Nathaniel just went through. And if there's anyone that's confused, please raise your hand, because this is at the crux of the issue that we're dealing with now. It was a miscalculation. It was not a decrease in funds. And the miscalculation was because of using and adding back into what was already calculated, because that's what we used to do with SCIF funds. So are there any questions? Does anyone have any questions before we start going into the menu of options? And please, there are no dumb questions. There are no, I should have known this, please. I just want to make sure that everyone understands before we go on to the next section.
Chancellor,
And
when we get
if anybody can help me with looking at, we have over 100 people or just at 100 people here, so
yes,
I might miss
Sorry.
someone.
I see Lowell's hand.
Yeah. Lowell had asked, when we get to the different scenarios, if we can clarify what it means and what the impact is of those scenarios.
I can try to do that when we get there. Yes, Lowell, I will happily try to do that.
And
Please.
his hand's still up.
I was just going to add, I'm just, the error was made. That's great that we caught it. And, but I'm just wondering, what if we had the right number to start with, what the proposal would have been? I don't imagine we would have been discussing which way to proceed, which is good, but I'm just wondering kind of what the original proposal would have been if the correct number had been there from the start.
Okay, that's an excellent question. I think what this does is highlights a challenge with our revenues and our expense budget that has existed for a while. We would have had to address some of those challenges. I think some of the options that are going to be presented are things that we would have had to think about that would have been reflected in the proposed adopted budget that we would have presented initially if our revenues were correctly calculated at the very beginning.
So Laura, let me also try to address that. One of the things that we have been discussing, and some of you are more intimately involved with it than others, is that we have been trying to implement a new resource allocation model following the student-centered funding formula. It has taken us about 2 years to actually come up with an agreement of what that resource allocation model is. We presented that to the board last year. That was the first reading. And we are working on implementing that this next year. Part of that is our infrastructure. We no longer have a district enrollment management committee, a DMC. We've been talking about resurrecting that. In fact, the commitment is to resurrect that committee so that when we determine FTES, it's broader based. And I won't use up the time to tell you how we got to the point of not having a committee and all of that. And I don't want to do revisionist history, but suffice it to say, we used to have a DMC. The DMC was disbanded by its members. Then the role of the DMC at that time was just to look at developing an enrollment management plan. So when the plan was completed, the committee went away. The role of the DMC, as I see it coming from a district that has a DMC still, is really to look and to provide input in coordination with the administration. And the administration means not the district office. The administration means the colleges. That means the student services area. That means instructional area. And that means the budget area, which is the finance area. And to look at that along with the president and anyone else that needs to be at the table and to make recommendations. That has not been happening. That has not been happening. And so we can't fall back on a system that has not been functioning to say this is what direction we can take. What we're trying to do is to build it as Dr. Who says that? McKinley likes to say, we're building an airplane while we're flying it. And that is the truth. We're trying to build a resource allocation model, which we have gotten through recommendations at the college, at the district. The PGC has approved it. The board needs to approve it. And we also need to disseminate that information across the district. We wanted to try to implement that this last year. And I talked to the budget committee. I also talked to the subcommittee, the BAM subcommittee. And I said, if I walk on campus and I walk up to anyone that has been here more than a year, and I say, do you understand what at that time we were calling it budget allocation model? And they said, probably not. I said, well, something that's going to affect every employee within this district probably needs to get a little bit broader dissemination. And oh, by the way, you cannot take it to the board and say, okay, we've done all of this. Now we just want you to pencil it and say, yes, it's good. They have to be brought along the way. They have to be brought along so that it doesn't wind up like our mission statement, where there was a lot of work on the mission statement. And then they brought it to the board as a fait accompli. And the board said, wait a minute, this is our mission statement too. And we have had no input into it. So I don't want to repeat the mistakes we've had before. And so to answer your question, I know it's a long answer, is that during this next year, that is exactly what we have to do. We have to make sure that people understand what the process is, that they feel that they're a part of the process. And that's why I stopped to ask people if you understand how we came up with the numbers, because that is essential to understanding how we are funded under this new student-centered funding formula. 70% is going to be based on FTES, and the other 30% is going to be based on other variables, you know, number of students that complete, number of students that transfer, retention rates. All of that is built into that formula. And we're not going into all those details, but suffice it to say, 70% of it is still going to be based on FTES. And hopefully, this is my goal, and I think this is the goal of the PBC, the PGC, as well as the BAM subcommittee, is that we move this forward so that when we submit budgets in the future, there will be no question about how we came up with the numbers, or why are we putting money over here versus over there. There should be greater transparency. And this unfortunate miscalculation has pushed that more to the forefront, but it was something, as Dr. Jones said, we were going to have to do anyway, because every recommendation that we've gotten has said we need to do this. And so this is just expediting it somewhat. Does that help to answer a little bit of where we are right now? Lowell? Or am I?
Acknowledging.
thumbs
He
up.
says yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I can only see the presenter because, anyway. All right. Any other questions, though? I really want people to understand this. No other questions? Okay, I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Jones.
Okay, thank you very much, Chancellor. So when it came to coming up with the menu of options, we really wanted to try to be more expansive in terms of coming up with buckets or menus of different kinds of things that we could do to cure the error that had occurred. So the first thing is to look at whether or not there was any additional revenues that could be brought to bear to increase the projected general fund, unrestricted general fund revenues. And so there was the HERF, or the funding that we received from the federal government pertaining to the impacts of the pandemic, had a provision that indicates that we could charge that grant for lost revenues and to charge it like a grant with regard to indirect cost recovery. And so if we apply those provisions of that federal funding, we could garner about 3.99 or $4 million dollars of additional unrestricted general fund revenues. So that obviously would take a good chunk out of that difference in revenue. So then the other options all are on the expense side of the budget. Chancellor?
Okay, I just want to explain something. When we say we're going to use, oh, I'm sorry. Did someone have a question? When we say we're going to use HERF funds, we were using HERF 3 funds to underwrite the return to campus activities, the hiring of forensic analytics, getting the deep wash when we had an external person doing that, to check the filters and get the filters clean, to install and do the testing. All of that came out of HERF 3. It had nothing to do with the actions under CARES or HERF 1 or 2. I want to say that first. And the reason that we can now go back and look at those HERF funds as options for the lost revenue is because we received more money this year from the state in the area of deferred maintenance. So those of you that have been around more than 5 years know that usually for the last few years, we've been getting a minimal amount of money for deferred maintenance. This budget, if you look at the assumptions in the budget book, identifies the additional funds that we are getting for deferred maintenance. So instead of using HERF funds for that, which is what we had planned on doing, we can now, as Dr. Jones indicate, look at using some of that revenue and offsetting those costs that we were going to be used for return to campus to deferred maintenance versus using HERF funds. Okay, I just I want to make that clear so everybody understands, and
That's-
you know, it isn't, we're taking things from students and using them to offset this. The campuses have their plans. Those plans were approved. And the agreement was that we would use HERF3, which is very broad in opening up the use for those HERF3 funds. As you might recall, those came about under President Biden. Because when we first got her funds, it wasn't even, we couldn't even use it with our students that, you know, are dreamers, if you recall. Then we had a change in presidency and that went away. And we also got these additional HERF3 funds. So just want to be clear on that. When we say we're going to use her funds, is not offsetting the plans that the colleges have had to use their funds. This was HERF3 funds that came about, and we thought at the time to use them for facilities, upkeep, and cleaning and sanitation and all of those things required to return to campus.
That's absolutely correct. And so if you recall, we didn't spend as much time talking about it, but when we looked at the one-time funding, there was $840 million of funding provided for scheduled maintenance and instructional equipment. And so it gave us the ability to do the planned return to campus work that we had anticipated needing to be done, but funding that work from outside of the HERF funds and using the physical plant and instructional equipment funds instead of using HERF funds to do that same scope of work. So that's the intent. Jennifer, I see your hand.
Also, Donald had asked if there was an amount for each of these buckets.
I can get into that in a bit. It'll be easier not to try to do that on this slide, but with the HERF, that number, it was readily available, and it sort of depends. But I will address that when I address each of those boxes to some extent. Okay.
Great. Dr. Shanowski?
Well, my question might wait, Nate. Are these the
Okay.
only buckets that you're looking at? And are you going to go through each of these? And then I have a question based on
Yes.
your responses.
Yes, I will go through each of these in a moment, and then we can talk about a little bit more of the details of those. So yes, it
Are
may.
there other ideas as well, or?
Well, we're open to other ideas for sure, but these are the large sort of areas. But let me get through it, and then if I don't provide an adequate answer to what you're thinking about, please ask a very, very specific question, and I'll try to answer for you. Okay?
Well, I think I have a specific question right
Okay, go ahead.
now, if these are the only buckets, if I may.
Yes, go right
So,
ahead.
A lot has been made about the FCMAT report in terms of reducing the number of FTEF that we have at our colleges and trying to increase productivity. But when you look at the FCMAT report and you actually look at what it says and quote the language, it says at one point, the combination of declining enrollment and increased staff creates a budget formula that's unsustainable. And it goes on in the executive summary to say that the number of administrators in the district office should be decreased. That's a direct quote. The district, and it goes on to give more details. And it says that the district office structure is cost prohibitive, inefficient, and adds to the ineffective and poor communication throughout the district. And what we've seen over the last several years is that the allocation of dollars to the district office increases every year more than even our apportionment from the state does. And also that we've increased the number of administrators at the district office. The district office currently has more administrators than any of the colleges, right? And the cost of the district office administrative staff is about a third of the overall cost of administrators throughout the district. So I'm just wondering why one of these buckets is not also doing the work of analyzing what is centralized and what is decentralized, eliminating redundant positions, making sure that we're streamlined from the top down, instead of continuing to really push on this narrative that 90-some% of our costs are employees, and looking at the faculty and staff when that is being considered.
All right, well, thank you for the question. So here's my my attempt at answering it. So in a nutshell, those enhancements or expense reductions are absolutely necessary, and that's exactly what we intend to do over the upcoming year, as the chancellor indicated, as we were talking about looking at developing and moving from the existing resource allocation to the new revenue resource allocation model, because what we've done is looked at the revenue side of it. But what needs to be done is to look at the expense budgeting side of it. And that takes into account district versus college and all those sorts of things. But let me also remind you, and I know that you are aware of this, that there's a distinction, and I don't know that we've been as how should I say, disciplined in terms of carefully segregating those. We have a chancellor's office, and that function is in many instances differentiated from district support services. Some instances we do a really good job of differentiating those, and then sometimes not as good of a job in a transparent and coherent way as we could. And so some of those district services are efforts where we have trying to gain economies of scale and to provide services to the entire district, but doing it in a way that we're not replicating these services, multiple times over throughout the district. So I do think that work is going to be done. However, when it comes to solving this particular problem, we don't have the luxury of time to do that. But the impact of some of those things are going to be realized through looking at the vacant positions, and some of those vacant positions obviously are at the district as well. And so that strategy does, in an indirect way, gets to some of what you are mentioning. So again, thank you for that. I see the chancellor has our hand up.
Chancellor, and then Dr. Shinosky.
Yes, I just wanted to respond to Jennifer's question, because this isn't the first forum that it's been brought up. And what I was saying when I answered Lowell's question earlier is that's exactly what we need to do. It wouldn't matter if the money was the same as it was what we projected, or if it was a different amount. We still need to go through and to do that. And right now, our infrastructure, we're building that infrastructure. One of the recommendations, for those of you that don't know, we have what we call a chancellor's work group. One of the recommendations from the chancellor's work group was for each of the district-wide committees, the participatory governance committees, to go back and use a template to identify what is your mission, what are your goals, which is what we were going to do at the PBIM summit, which is in the future, that you want to accomplish this year. And how does that work towards supporting this new budget allocation model idea and the resource allocation model? And right now, we're building that. That hasn't been done. One of the components of that is to look at our structure. This last year, I made recommendations for the district office, even though we haven't gone through the full process of reaffirming all of our district-wide committees, what their structure is, who appoints them, the length of time that they're there, all of those things. We haven't done that. People get on a committee and they stay on it year after year after year. And I think we should have a little bit more structure of that has gone through the vetting process. And as we all know, when you go through the participatory governance process, nothing happens quickly. We have what, 6 days? We have 7 days to come up with an adjustment to this budget. I doubt if we're going to go through the full participatory governance process in 7 days when we haven't done it in years to come up with a budget. So trying to fit that into this discussion, I think we need to focus on what is the object at hand. What you're talking about, Jennifer, in my mind, is a strategic goal. It is not something that is going to be accomplished in 7 days. This goes to the board for approval by law. It has to be done before the end of the month. So unless the board has a special meeting, which it could have, we only have to give 24-hour notice. We have until the next board meeting, which is September the 27th. So we got that. We didn't put that there as a bucket because I don't think we can get through it in time with this one meeting. And possibly, we thought we might be able to have another meeting with the PBIM, but people's schedules just don't allow it with this short notice. It took us a long time to come up with this date. So we haven't put that out to the side. But as I said, I've used the functional map to align some things even at the district office where I have control over that and made that recommendation to the board. And that's where we are right now at the district. Is that the only thing that's going to happen at the district? I doubt it. We need to relook at how we function. And that can't happen in 7 days.
Thank you, Chancellor. I appreciate the comment. Jennifer, did you have a follow-up? Because you had your hand up, but then you took it down.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that, but I'm not trying to, pick at anything, or I just, for those of us that have been attending these meetings for a number of years, these are the same things we hear every year, whether there was a mistake made or not. The budget book was presented to everyone in August with the error. We didn't have time to give input on that either. The tentative budget that we were given in May does give us sort of an outline of what the current budget should look like, as it pretty much reflects, I know it's not perfect, but it pretty much reflects the revenues we're getting. So to my mind, I think that if we are really trying to engage people in conversations about how to shift the budget, we have to start this now for next year. And I literally say this every single year for the last 6 years. We have to commit to it publicly and make a change, because it is not acceptable to me to hear year after year that we don't have time to make changes. And then year after year, we add additional resources to the district office that doesn't serve any FTES directly, right? And we talk about these things. So, I know that many of us in faculty leadership are extremely frustrated. And we're frustrated because we keep asking for some very simple, basic planning processes. And we're told every single year to wait until maybe next year, or we don't have time to do it. And many of the administrators in this room, you don't have to nod your head or anything, but you've heard me say it year after year too. If you've been here for more than a year, you know, this is a drum that we've all been beating. So, you know, we're sitting here now, we have a tentative budget. I don't understand why there's this crisis that we're presenting and we can't use the tentative budget. And I also don't understand why we can't be using our unaudited actuals from last year to actually make a better budget. And last year we had less revenue than we're having this year. So we really are increasing this year compared with last year. We're just not increasing as much as we thought we were.
You're absolutely right on that, Jennifer. We have step and column increases that are increasing. Yeah, we do have increase, but I still don't think, and I can't speak for anything before April 16th of 2021. So, you know, I've heard you say that. I wasn't here. If I'd been here, maybe it would be different. I don't know. But I will tell you, our processes go slow. I tried to get a committee together, an example, for our holistic safety. It got approved in March. That came up with the PBIM that we had last year around August or September. And it took from that time until March to come up with the structure for a committee. And that's a committee. That's not a major change in our budget and how we create it, how we vet it, and then how we adopt it. And what I'm saying is we've been working on that, I guess it was the BAM subcommittee has been working on that for 2 years. So to then expect that we're going to make all of those changes, I think is unrealistic in 7 days. Yeah, we have to work on it this year. That's part of why it's on the agenda for the PBIM for us to discuss that. How are we going to move forward? What are we going to look at? What are the tasks and the action items that need to be accomplished within a certain period of time so that we can actually realize all of those plans and not just kick it down the road another year? And you're absolutely right on that.
Garth
I would
Gleason has
add-
a hand up.
Yeah, I would add to what the chancellor said and she's also communicated to me that that's something that she really, really wants to be accomplished. And fortunately, that is an area that I have direct experience at working at 2 other institutions to actually implement a significant budget change in terms of changing the budgeting model. And so that's one of the reasons that she thought that I could be helpful in terms of supporting the district at this time to make that transition. So it's a priority. I'm a very, very strong supporter of planning, budgeting, and assessment, which is the third one that we have to do in accordance with standard 3 of the accreditation. And that's an area where we have some additional work to do as well, but integrating all 3 of those processes in a thoughtful and appropriate way and institutionalizing it so that we actually have the evidence that not only do we have it codified as a process, but we're actually doing the work and creating the evidence that provides documentation that we are actually living those processes, not just having pretty pictures on an integrated budgeting model that sits on the shelf, but not in actuality. So I do understand and I recognize the importance of it, and I'm a very strong supporter of doing that work.
Great. Garth Gleason?
Thank you, Mark. I was just going to ask, in this context for this particular meeting, we're seeking to solve the issues for this year's fiscal budget, but since this is a one-time fix, are we also trying to fix the issues for next year? And then what about the hold harmless year the following year?
All right, great question. So the answer is a little bit of yes, in terms of addressing the issue for this year. However, as we address the issue for this year, we do so with an eye towards making an incremental improvement that inures to our benefit in the longer term. So it's yes and yes is the way I would characterize it. And when I get to the point where we actually start looking at some of that, you'll see that a little bit more clearly. Okay. All right. Well, great questions, everyone. So thank you for that. So we talked about the revenue side. We've already hinted a little bit about reducing the budget for vacant positions. Now, what the next 5 boxes have in common are that they look at expense budget line items within our budget. These are the places where we can make adjustments. You know, because if it's not already in the budget, we can't necessarily make an adjustment to it. And so that's what differences these are applying. So we look at different lineup. So the amount that we choose to use in these areas may go up or down, but these are line items within the existing budget. And those are the places where we could possibly make adjustments differently than what was in the budget that was previously presented. And Jennifer mentioned about the tentative budget. Yes, we can look at that, but the expense categories that are here are the same ones that were there. And so what we can talk about is what were the changes? Can we afford to make those changes now in light of the fact that we have less revenues and so forth? So essentially, these are really the major areas within our budget, because we aren't creating and adding new line items to the budget. These are the existing ones. And so they are the ones that we may need to look at to determine which ones can be adjusted to help us to close the gap between what our real revenues are and what we had initially indicated as the expense budget line items. So the only thing that I am going to spend a little time here on, very little, and then we're going to get into some of the options, is just helping you understand, okay, here is the overall revenue, and then here are the expense line items of the budget. And those 5 categories are basically coming from these various line items within the budget. And so we look, okay, academic, full-time academic, academic administrator, other faculty, part-time academic, salary for classified staff, employee benefits, book supplies and services, and then, small amount for capital outlay, debt servicing for the bond, and then what we call other outgoes that also include our payments for our OPEB liability. These are the expense line items of the budget, and these are the ones that we could perhaps adjust and make differently. So if we want, by comparison, remember this is what is in the existing budget book that does have the error. But when we look at what was in the budget last year, this is what the budget was last year. So it had a total revenues of $148.7 million. And then we had these in terms of the expense budget. So there was a slight variance, budgeted variance, meaning that the projected expenses were just a little bit less than the projected revenues from last year. And so we looked at that, and that does inform the development of the newly proposed budget. And some of these things we have some more control over, others a little bit less. We're still committed to providing our employees step and column increases because that's scheduled. Even if we don't get more money, we are committed to maintaining our salary schedules. And if someone is entitled to go from step 1 to step 2, we do that. But when we say we're going to do that and honor that commitment, that costs us more money. It costs us more money in salary, but it also costs us more money in terms of benefits. And then if the state approves a COLA and we make the decision to allow employees to benefit from that COLA, meaning that we increase their salaries with that same, at that same level of COLA, well, that increases the salary and benefit line items too. And so when we look at that, half the time, most of the revenue increases are consumed by us passing on those COLA increases that drive up the cost of salaries and the cost of benefits. And once we make that decision, it's done. And so a lot of time, those additional resources that we get as a district are already consumed if we decide to pass on those COLA increases to our employees. And we recognize, and we have last year, and we try to do that again this year, a high percentage of the resources to support higher COLAs or give the employees the full or near full benefit of those increases, because the administration does recognize the fact that we have a compensation study to suggest that we aren't paid as well as some of the other districts. And so that is a priority because we do value our employees. And so we consciously have tried to do that. And that's where a lot of those resources have gone. The other thing that was mentioned about looking at some of the liabilities. One of the things that we need to do is to, Garth was mentioning this about thinking about things for future years. One of the things that we want to try to do when and where we can, when we have or think we have additional revenues, is what can we do to improve the overall fiscal health of the district? Well, one thing that we have to look at is, what is our, fiscal liabilities? What does that look like? Well, quite honest, we have some significantly concerning liabilities in terms of debt servicing for the OPEB bond trust. We have more than $30 million in terms of debt, student debt that we have not collected, and we don't have more robust, strategies to try to get those revenues, and they're just sitting on our book as a liability. Those are things that harm our fiscal viability and fiscal health that was noted in the FCMAT report that we should try to deal with. And so there was also a conscious effort to try to improve some of those values. So you saw that there was some increases to some of these to try to begin improving the fiscal health of the district at large. And so I wanted to make that that point as well. So let's move on. And so here's what we are needing to deal with. We know that there was an overstatement of revenues 11.6. And if you recall from, let's go back, that when this was the draft adopted budget that you saw in the budget book, that includes the error. But what you'll see here is that last year we projected, an operating variance of $227,000. What was projected this time, based on that, the previous adopted budget projected, was $2.74 million operating variance. Essentially, we were projecting, having $167.8 million in revenues and budgeted expenses at the tune of $165 million and an operating variance of 2.74. So when we go to this slide, in terms of correcting that overstatement of revenue, what is being proposed is that we reduce that operating variance, go down from 2.7 to only $500,000, and therefore needing only to make reductions in the expense line items of $9.5 million as compared to $11.6 million. So once again, really trying to minimize the quote unquote reductions in the expense budget line items that we would have to make. And so here are the two options that we came up with. So this is option number one. There's a lot of similarity because there's only a certain number of degrees of freedom that we have when it comes to coming up with strategy. We are essentially limited to where's the money? The money is in these various line items. That's it. Each of those represents an opportunity to make an adjustment. And we try to be more thoughtful about how and which line items we would make reduction in, such that a couple of things are tried to be protected. One, to highly prioritize not having adverse impacts on positions that are filled with incumbents. Number two, that does not increase our fiscal liabilities. Number three, does not put us in a more precarious issue relative to outside agencies viewing our financials. For example, we are trying to do a new bond issuance for supporting our capital programs. Well, we have to maintain our financial information in such a way that it doesn't create additional concern by the rating agencies, because as you may or may not be aware, our rating took a hit last year, in part because of our perceived risk to potential investors for those bonds. And so we're trying to maintain a good, strong, healthy fund balance that doesn't show a decline. And if you notice, one of the options was to do that, to use some of our ending balance or fund balance to help deal with that. But that would have a really significant impact in the longer term, and more immediately as well. We're going to pay more for when we actually have to, issue debt, which is not the best strategy. So that's that. Then what we looked at is trying to make sure that when and where possible, other things that would affect directly instruction would be protected to the highest extent that we could as well. So these were some of the factors that were prioritized in terms of trying to come up with strategies to cure the problem, but do it in a responsible and appropriate manner. And so what you may or may not know is that when we have a position, from a budgeting standpoint, we make the budgetary assumption that that position is going to be filled 100% of the time with someone. If you've been around any length of time, you know that that assumption rarely is fulfilled absolutely. That means that at some point during the course of the fiscal year, some positions are going to be vacant. Okay? And so one of the strategy was in looking at the vacant positions, knowing that some positions are going to be vacant at some point during the course of the fiscal year, let's budget in a way that allows us to capture, from a budgetary standpoint, some of those resources to offset the reduction that is needed. And that affects the salary line items, and that's all salaries. That includes faculty, that includes staff, that includes administrators. Because I want to be clear that just because it's under the classified staff, it's not that we're targeting that. It's all staff. And then the other expense item that's correlated is the benefit side. And we are, and some of you are aware of this, we're looking at whether or not we can adopt a new benefit plan. Because if we're able to adopt the new benefit plan, it does two things for us. One, potentially, we are able to overall reduce the budget for the benefits, but then also it frees up resources that we can actually increase salaries to deal with the low compensation of our employees. And so we're looking at that as well as a possibility to help with that. That was one of the other options that was discussed. Because that hasn't been fully approved, because that's an item of negotiation, I couldn't claim any of that as part of a budget strategy because that hasn't been approved and ratified by our collective bargaining partners. But nonetheless, I'm showing you that that's an area where there could be a reduction there. And then the other areas have to do with, the debt servicing, and also in terms of the OPEB liabilities, paring back a little bit on the increases that we had originally hoped to be able to provide to strengthen our fiscal health as a district. So we'll, do that in a much more gradual way is essentially what we're talking about. And so this option shows 45% of those positions being used to help offset this, and then using the additional revenues from the HERF to account for that. The other option is very similar, with the main difference being the amount. This is a lower percentage, and therefore some of the reductions in terms of the debt and things like that have to be used to offset that. In addition, there was escalation. We assumed that costs of like utilities and other kinds of things are going to increase. And so we had assumed a 2% growth in terms of the book supplies line item. So we said, okay, we can't afford that. And so we're going to have to keep that flat. And so we didn't plan for additional increases. And so we'll have to figure out ways to operate more efficiently or have less resources to go towards those kinds of operating expenses that we incur just doing the normal business of the colleges and the district. So, but those in a high level, those were the ways in which we had proposed doing that. And then there were some changes that we wanted to, originally we did not have, because this option 2 was a little bit more risky. We did not have any contingency reserves, and I didn't think that that was fiscally responsible. So we have a very, very modest contingency reserve that was added back in just to help us to mitigate something if it went somewhat awry. So Donald, I see your hand, sir.
Yeah, it's just gonna ask, Donald Moore has a hand up.
Thank you for the to show this, Dr. Jones. What I'm curious about is all of these buckets have monies in there that we could utilize, from the reserve or from the salary savings or from the, but the reality appears to me, just looking at the different sums, is that we can't get 11 million directly from one particular one, or it seems like it wouldn't be prudent to do that. And as a fiscal person, I'm assuming you would be much more conservative about that, and that there would have to be some collage of this, to as not to impact on any one area greatly. And again, that's only to address this year's budget. And I think people need to understand, like, what's it mean by budgets, right? Because sometimes they don't understand that. And it, even if we were to reduce a little bit of the 17%, the point I'm making is it just seems like it'll have to be a number of these budgets. So I don't have a suggestion per se that says we should reduce this one more at this amount or this one more at that amount. And I think that that would have to really be at where you're looking at it really, really carefully. And I don't know necessarily in this venue, it's the appropriate way to do so. But I do think that part of what we're grappling with and is that on the revenue side, we really need to be much more intentional on what we're doing to increase it. On the expenditure side, we really need to let people understand that 94% of all of our revenue is tied up in salaries, and that FICMAT and the state chancellor's office and all the other folks all say that when you start getting into the 90s, 94, 95s, it's not sustainable. That the average is somewhere around 88% or something like that. And
between 85 and 87%.
Yeah, 85 and 87%. And so partly when you look at that immediately, you begin to realize the enormity of it. And you begin to realize the enormity of the fact that because we have salary savings, we could basically create this budget the way it is with these fund balances and so on. So I do think that somehow we need to do a much more longer term critical look at how do we increase our revenue and how do we reduce our expenditures. But for this exercise, we know that there's only these buckets that we could get into that, and we need to just do it. But the other part is something that whether PBC or some group really needs to begin to look at the expenditures. And I hope that the enrollment committee really begins to look and intentionally looks at how can we increase our revenue? Because ultimately, whether it's the SCIF or our FTES, we have to look at what are those buckets that we need to increase. And what I don't see now is I don't see really much movement from the colleges and their strategic plans. They are incrementally looking at stuff when we need to be much more intentional about it, because in the past, we really haven't intentionally said dual enrollment and then said we want X amount of dollars coming from it. Instead, we haphazardly from the different colleges went after it to some degree or another. And we realized at a certain point that, wow, that's $6 million, you know, but we really never really made the effort. And so there's I guess there's monies to be had out there, but we need to be much more intentional about it. On this, my concern is that when you look at the bad debt, and I keep on coming, I've been harping on this since the first time we had this bad debt issue back in 2010, 11. The problem with this student debt is that the board has made it plain a couple of years ago that they don't want to get rid of the ability of students to basically say they're going to pay it back. And if they never pay it back, oh well, because we get the money on their bodies and the money that we get from the state. But I don't know if we could continue to sustain this. Last year, we used about $7 million of the HERF fund to pay down this debt. We rationalized it because of the pandemic, but this grows more than what we have the ability to pay. And so this year we're going to pay, you know, roughly about $2 million in bad debt. That means that in essence, we're going to wipe out $2 million. Even if you sustain it and try to wipe out $2 million a year, the $30 million that's there is just going to continue to grow up. So every time you do the 2 million, it will grow, you know, to be 35 million instead of 37 million, but it just will continue to grow up and at a compounded rate. So we really need to look at those because we can't sustain those or the OPEB, you know, that we take out of the general fund, larger and larger increases. And if the recession happens, are we going to be affected with how much money we're going to be able, how much money we're going to have to pull out of the general fund in order to pay these things? So I really do think we need to, while looking at and addressing this, we really need to look at the longer term issues.
Donald, you made several points that I think are really, really spot on, and I'll take a moment and address a couple of them. One is we have been and doing what in the financial world we call straight incremental budgeting. You know, what was your budget last year? Make some minor adjustment to it, plus or minus, and that's going to be your budget for the current year. I am a very, very strong and staunch supporter of strategic budgeting. And I think we are beginning to make that turn with adopting a new resource allocation model that is more designed under the RCM or resource centered model of budgeting. But we have the revenue side of that, but we don't have the expense side of that budgeting approach, developed. And that's something that we are going to be doing. And I think that that's really, really important and necessary work to be done. The other thing that I think is important, and I have a slide to talk about some of those ideas, would be we absolutely need to look at how do we begin to bend down the cost curve. And that includes really, really carefully looking at our approaches and the way in which expenses are
This is something else real quick, because I couldn't hear it
expenses.
while the meeting was going on this phone.
Can we mute whoever is speaking? All right, to really look at what are those drivers for expense increases and see whether or not we can begin to address some of those things. And you were mentioning a policy when it comes to dealing with student debt. Are there other ways that we can deal with that that would allow us to begin to reduce those costs? A good case in point is the benefit. Is there a different approach to how we get our benefits such that we get the same outcome, but at a lower cost point? Are there other things? I think the chancellor was mentioning and when she was responding to Jennifer about having a conversation about when does it make sense to have things centralized versus decentralized. We have to engage in those kinds of conversations to look at, are there efficiencies that we can garner such that the overall quality of the work that we do is not affected, but we're able to do it more cost effectively. And so I think that that is absolutely important for us to do. And I think that one of the things that is needed in that regard is a more detailed cost analysis. And we haven't done that. And I think that that's something that would be very, very helpful. And I, with my colleagues at my former district, did that. And we did it on a cost per FTS basis that includes the full range of district operation, direct instruction, student services, administration, and including the district office. All of that was rolled into the overall cost of delivering the instruction to the students. And we had a good idea on a cost per FTS basis, what things were costing. And so we could make more intelligent decisions about some of these things and to garner advantages when and where it made sense to reduce the cost, but not adversely affect the quantity or quality of instruction.
Garth Queeson has a hand up.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I was just going to suggest of the two adjustments, I kind of like option number one better. But one of the things I noticed is that there seem to be one-time changes or cuts, like you said, not a long-term solution, right? I have to feel that there's going to be expenses or changes for next year's budget as well, like I said, when the hold harmless comes. So I'd like to see more of permanent rather than one time, if that's possible. But that's why I like the option number one a little better.
Okay, so let me thank you very much, Garth, for that question. Let me give you some additional information. So the way in which the freezing of positions could work is we could identify specific positions and freeze those and pull those out of the budget, and that provides, in a sense, a more quote unquote permanent reduction. Okay, that could be done. We may do that. We may do a more passive approach, which is to garner salary and benefit savings, because we know that we have certain vacant positions right now, and that even when we allow them all to continue along their path of recruitment, that we may get very, very close to the amount of money by just recognizing the fact that they're not likely to be hired until, say, after January. And so right now, what we have, and this number changes from day to day, is about 90 to 95 vacant positions. And the estimated budget for that is about $14 million. Okay, so so if we know that any of those, if we look at each of those positions, and if we look at which of those positions are currently in recruitment, just looking at the ones that are in current recruitment or the recruitment hasn't begun, if we just look at those, we would be able to recognize that, given how and this is no disrespect for our HR colleagues, but just in terms of the process and things like that, none of those individuals will be hitting our payroll until probably at the very, very earliest January. Just being candid. So that means that we've garnered 6 months worth of salary saving that could deal with the current year, but then we'd have to have a similar conversation of what's going on for next year. That's the other option. Or the other one would just be to freeze, take those 95 positions, these were freezing, and then they're frozen until such future date and time that we actually have revenues that will allow us to add them back into the budget. So two different approaches, both are which could allow us in the short term to meet the needed reduction, but it's a slightly different approach. One requires us to kind of do this year over year, or the other allows us to just sort of do it and freeze a certain subset of positions more on a semi-permanent basis for some defined number of years going into the future. So good question.
Thank you. Time check. So we're 90 minutes into the call. We've got another half hour. So just heads up on that. There were some questions. Several questions are asking about instruction for the spring semester and whether we'll be able to offer the same amount of classes or more in the spring as we did in the fall or in the prior year.
Okay, so the question with regard to that is, the short answer is that depends. I can't say with absolute certainty whether or not we are or are not going to offer the same number of sections. What I can say is, if we do not offer the same number of sections, it will not be because we are instituting a budget reduction to force that.
Great.
Okay, that I can say. We may not have demand. There may be other considerations. Courses, we may run a course, but then the course may not have enough enrollment to warrant continue, and the course get canceled. So it's hard to say whether we will absolutely have the same number of sections. What I can say is that we are not planning for a reduction in the spring schedule to meet some sort of defined budget reduction. That is not what we are doing. That's not what we are seeking to do. So just want to be really clear about that.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. And I think that was the board president's parting comment on the topic on Tuesday night was any reduction should be as far from the students as possible. And I think that's reflected in this. let's see, Leslie Blackley, I'm sorry, Leslie Blackie, sorry.
Thank you. All right. So the mission of an education institution is to actually educate students. The way we are funded is through FTEs, but yet last year we were given a severe reduction on the classes that we were able to plan for both fall and spring. So while it is encouraging that you're not going to ask us for more slashes, if we want to grow enrollment, we have to be able to offer more sections. And if we wish to be able to identify a variety of modalities for students to see if they are going to be more comfortable taking face-to-face as we try and return back to face-to-face or hybrid or online, we have to have more FTES allotted to us. So there's a lot of discussion here. There's a lot of hand waving about where all this other money is going, but ultimately, and this was asked by Jennifer Shanowski, it's asked again and again and again, ultimately, the faculty continue to be told you have to do more with less, even though we are actually the revenue generators because we make the classes for the FTEs, right? So that's a huge problem. The other issue is that we didn't ever really get an answer about why we continue to hire more and more and more district administrators, more and more interim or acting. That's not even going through shared governance. That's another issue that's a problem. But ultimately, we have spent 90 minutes and there have been multiple questions in the chat about what is actually happening to our revenue generating, our FTESs. And that really hasn't been answered. And even now, you've just said, oh, well, we're not going to cut more, but maybe if you chose the wrong modality, that sucks for you and we're going to cancel classes. And that means people aren't going to be able to be paid. Brad is probably going to follow up and articulate this even better than me. So I'm just going to hand it straight to Brad.
Okay, well, before taking another question, let me provide a bit of a response. I think that contrary to common understanding, we don't make cuts to FTF just for the sake of cutting FTF. What is done is those items are done with regard to the VPI working with the deans and the chairs to put forward a schedule that stays within the fiscal resources that we have. That's one. What is not always as crystal clear is even though, and we spent a lot of time talking about the budget and things like that, and as we should. However, the reality is that while there are some classes that do in fact get cut, that's regrettable for sure, but there is a process for doing that. It's not done unilaterally. And number two, if you look over time, our overall spending, laying aside for a moment what the budget is the plan for what we spend, but the actual spending, we're actually spending a lot more money in terms of our part-time faculty than what is budgeted, to the tune of some $7 million over budget. So we got to look at actually what we spent, not just in what was budgeted, but looking at what we are actually doing in terms of the schedule and how does that relate to the budget. Last year, we ended the year, quote unquote, in the black, but not by much. In the previous year, our overall ending balance was a reduction, which meant that we overspent the budget. As much as the faculty are saying, hey, you guys shouldn't have cut the FTF, well, maybe we shouldn't. But what we did realize is that it didn't matter because we spent too much anyways, and we ended in the black, in the red. That's not sustainable. And that causes the state and others that pay attention to our fiscal condition to say, you don't have appropriate internal controls when you are allowing year after year for your budget to be overspent. That's not a good thing for our district.
Dr. Jones,
Yes, sir.
I'm a little concerned with the comment you made at the beginning of your remarks, where you said that you don't know if our class offerings are less or the same as they were in 21-22, because the FTEF allocation for the district is established well before now. And so we should know concretely exactly how our FTEF, and we do know how our FTEF allocation is for 22-23 versus what it was for 21-22. These are hard and fast numbers that are distributed in a very top-down fashion from the district to the colleges at the end of the spring semester, around there. So we should already be thinking now about what our FTEF allocation is going to be in 23-24. I've never understood why there isn't more of a direct discussion between these budgets and FTEF. Because while FTEF is a number, ultimately it translates to a dollar amount. So we should see, you're commenting about how we overspent 1351 part-time faculty. Well, part of that is because we're not budgeting in a realistic and accurate way with our part-time faculty. We've been splitting the part-time faculty budget between what used to be Measure B and Fund 1. Now it's Measure E and Fund 1. And we do not budget in a way that shows the whole, we do not present this data in a way that shows all the information, because we know that some of our budget for part-time faculty comes out of Measure E. What I would like to see is an honest and comprehensive display of part-time faculty funding in 21-22, when you combine Fund 1 and Measure E versus 22-23, and how that relates to FTEF allocations. And if we're truly doing a bottom-up budgeting and planning schedule where our class sections are being offered based on student demand, then we should not be handed down these FTEF allocations from the district. They should come bottom up from individual programs up through deans and vice presidents, and have a discussion with the district about what is a realistic student-centered FTEF allocation. We should be talking about that right now for 23-24, and those numbers should be used to develop realistic 1351 and Measure E budgets for the following year's budget.
Okay, Brad, thank you very much for your comment, but I don't disagree with many of your statements. There is one thing that I will indicate that should be corrected. I was asked whether or not the number of sections for the spring would be decreased. And I indicated I do not know, because that's something that is left to the VPIs working with the deans and directors. I did not say that we did not know what the FTEF allocation for the year would be. We definitely do know that for the whole year. And but that being said, once again, individual campuses may choose to change that allocation if they want. What we have determined is what the annualized allocation per college is, and that did not change and won't change. But what a given college does in terms of moving that from term to term or whatever, that certainly could change.
So Dr. Jones, so one FTEF is 5 sections. So we actually do know the number of sections per college that are scheduled for spring 23. Are you saying that BPIs have the discretion to override their FTEF allocation and number of sections in planning?
They've been doing that for years, Brad. I'm sorry for interrupting, but that's what Dr. Jones is saying. They've been doing that.
So VPIs do have the right to.
No, they don't have the right. They've been doing it because we haven't had strong controls. and monitoring of those expenditures. And I just want to go back because I don't want to get into a tit for tat of this or that, because there's a lot of misinformation that's out there. Measure E, which is a parcel tax, can be used for any instructional support. It can be used for a full-time equivalent faculty, whether they're working part-time or full-time. It can be used for student services that support instruction. It can be used for library support if it's in support of that. It can be used for instructional aids. So it is not just, and that's a misnomer that people say, is that it's for FTEF. It is not. It's up to the discretion of the college based upon the amount of allocation, how they want to use those funds. The other thing is, for FTEF, and maybe you weren't here at the beginning when I stated this, so I'll do it again, is that the district enrollment management committee from the district that I came from does all of the things that you're talking about. And because it includes faculty in it, that information gets disseminated. It is not from the district. It is really supposed to be from a collaborative effort. In this particular district, Peralta District, that committee disbanded. That committee never provided that type of input. From my understanding, again, I'm getting this second, third hand, but that committee, my knowledge of why it was created was to develop an enrollment management plan. When that enrollment management plan was completed for each college, that committee decided that their job was done and they disbanded. So what I said earlier is that that committee, in conjunction with meeting with the academic senate presidents at each college, as well as the district academic senate president, we met twice in the spring, and the recommendation was we move forward to re-implementing that committee. That way, those discussions that you're talking about right now are not misrepresented, that it came from the top down. I can assure you it did not. It came from a collaborative effort with the senior administrators at each college. That's the vice president of instruction and the vice presidents of student services. And what the colleges did on their particular campus, I can't speak to, but I do know from what I've been told is that they do exactly what Dr. Jones said. They meet with their deans, they meet with their chairs, and they come up with a plan based upon the FTEF allocation. So that's how it's been done in this district. I've explained it on multiple occasions. I get a recommendation through the vice president of academic affairs and student success based upon that collaborative discussion. We look at the budget and then I make a decision on what that should be. I would encourage any of you that have not done so to go to board docs and go under presentations. When you go to the library, you go over and it says presentations and look for the Enrollment Academy slides. In that presentation, we showed why we did and took the actions that we did, because we had a gap, and that gap was continuing to grow, not based upon the plan, but based upon the actual spending. And the growth and the growth in terms of spending was not proportional to the growth or lack of growth or decline that was happening in enrollment. And what we were told is that we do need to make an adjustment. Do we need to make other adjustments in our system? Absolutely. Absolutely, we need to do that. And that is going to take some work, and a commitment, because it's not going to be easy. We hired a consultant, CM from Cambridge West, who worked with the budget committee and also worked with the subcommittee on the BAM. And now he's working with us, and he said in more than one occasion, he's made presentations at each of the colleges. He's made presentations at the college council, at the president's roundtable. He's made a presentation to the academic senate. And what he has said is, this next year, I'm going to be asking some tough questions, and people aren't going to like it. But I'm going to have to do that if we're going to have to move this. So we need to have the data in front of us, because I have people giving all kinds of things in public settings that isn't really accurate. And
Chancellor,
I want to make sure that we look at the data, and we do it in a way that I'm not looking out for my own self-interest. I'm looking out is what is the self-interest of the district, and the district is what serves the students, and the colleges and the district office make up that district. It's not one or the other. It's not just the colleges, and it's not just the district office. It's not just the district service centers. It's all of us together. That's why we're Peralta Communication. I think that's one of the problems is communication, but community college districts. And we have to have those hard, honest discussions. We absolutely do, or we will be, like Jennifer said, doing this year after year after year. For me, the buck stops here. The board asked me to get us to that point, and that's what I'm trying to do. But this was kind of an anomaly, miscalculations. We thought we would be able to do a lot of things that right now we probably may not be able to do, or maybe to do it in a more restrained manner. But one of the things I asked the presidents, because what you're looking at is what Dr. Jones put up. We can look at a 45% cut here, looking at these categories. We can look at a 35% cut, looking at these categories. When I was a president, I wanted to know, what does that 35% or 45% represent for my college? And what I've told the presidents is they need to go and look at all of the vacant positions that are out there that are included in the numbers that you're looking at now on the screen. And they, not Jeanette Jackson, not Nathaniel Jones or Stephanie Droker or anybody at the district office, the colleges with their constituency groups and whatever mechanisms they use for communication, come back to me and tell me, of those positions, what are critical positions that you have to have this year? Not saying you don't need it, but what do you have to have this year? And then once we get that, maybe the answer is already done for us. Maybe we have less than 35% or more than 35%. I don't know. But we've got to do that first. We can't just come up with a number off the top and say we have X amount of vacancies, let's take 35%, because it's a real number. It's a person or it's a position, and it belongs to a certain location. And the other thing, just for everyone to know, and I'm not going to put it up now because I've been going back and forth over numbers. And in some cases, people change the numbers, or people are advocating for positions that were not originally approved. But in May 25th of 2021, again, this is in board docs. All I got to do is go out there and look for it. I made a presentation to the board because when I came here, on the table was the hiring of 44 positions. And I said, can we afford 44 positions? And no one could give me an answer to that. And I put a halt to all hiring until we could do an assessment. That's the part that Dr. Jones just said we don't do. We did an assessment. We looked at our budget. We came to an agreement that this is what we need to reduce for this next year, based upon all of the positions that we have, based upon the revenue that we have coming in, and based upon our expenditures from previous years. And we came up with a recommendation. It is out there in the board report that shows what those numbers are. What I'm trying to do is reconcile what those numbers were that we said we were going to hire with what we actually did hire. And you would think that that would be easy to do. Well, it's not so easy as you think. So I'm trying to get that. That will be presented to the board at its regular meeting. And it will also be presented at the PBIM when we have our meeting then. But I'm not looking at individual colleges when we do the summative amount that you're looking at right now on the screen, but that translates into particular positions at the colleges and at the district office. That's what we don't have right now. And that's what we're working on. And I beg for your indulgence and your patience. But again, we found out about this in writing on the 30th. We're not even, finished with the month to try to come to some kind of resolution on how we're going to move forward. And what we're trying to do is to make sure that we stay away from the classroom as much as possible. And the easiest way to do that is to look at vacant positions, which is why that is the option 1 and 2 that we put up before you. There's some others that people, and I captured those. I'm sure other people captured them too. I put a freeze on administrative hiring, put a freeze on step increases. Someone else said, go back and recalculate or renegotiate contracts with vendors. Another person said, stop the outsourcing. I captured all of those things, because those are options, but I don't think they're options that we can do in 6 days, 7 days. And as Dr. Jones also said, what we're capturing is not just for now. Those are things that we should also look at strategically. So I really don't want to get into, I want recommendations rather than why are we doing this or why are we doing that, because that isn't getting to the real crux that in 7 days, I've got to get a budget passed, or the board is going to have a special meeting before the end of the month, and then they will make a decision based upon what we recommend. So I'm trying to capture your ideas of how to address it, but I don't want to keep getting wrapped around the axle, as we say in the military, because it's not getting us anywhere. So.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Chancellor. We've
Chancellor.
got 3 minutes left and 2 hands up. Robert Brem and CM, and actually 3 hands up. Lowell all have hands up.
Were you calling on me?
Yeah, Robert, go ahead.
So
And
I
then
want
Sam.
to I want to punctuate what Chancellor Jackson said at least twice since I've been on, that our enrollment management sucks. And anyone who knows me knows that I've been saying this for 10 years, and apparently we got dinged on it in our accreditation. So in my opinion, the internal controls that Nate was talking about is also an issue, and where I would focus personally is in enrollment management. We need to strategically schedule. We need to have discussions between the 4 colleges. We need to compete. We need to schedule in a way that does not compete with each of the colleges. We need to offer fewer sections at the beginning of each semester, and as they fill, then add new sections. And by the end of each semester, thinking strategically in a coordinated fashion based on inter-college discussions and cooperation, not competition, then perhaps at the end of each semester, all of our courses will have much better revenue from the FTES, FTEF balance. But right now, each individual department throws a whole bunch of courses against the wall and sees what sticks. And then we cut courses left and right. Many of them are under-enrolled. And then we wonder why our revenue stream sucks. Sorry to use a clinical term. So at any rate, I try to be very quick and also have a little impact. But I just want to say that that committee needs to be reconstructed. It needs to be told, how are we going to solve this problem of strategic, coordinated, and cooperative scheduling?
Very good. Thank you, Robert. Appreciate the comment. CM.
Hi, good afternoon. I've been listening quite a bit. I just wanted to clarify a couple of minor things because it will be very helpful to everybody. One has to do with student center funding formula and the way we have assisted the Peralta district and the colleges to develop a student center funding formula for allocation purposes. And it is not just an allocation purpose, it comes with a lot of other extreme authority to the colleges, where colleges can do so many things for themselves on their own, rather than waiting for the district to tell them what to do. What we'd like to do is changing the role of the district to facilitate the colleges in a way that the colleges can do better job of managing the FTES, managing the FTEF, and their resources coming to the colleges. And that was the main reason, as Professor Brem have pointed it out, it will inherently allow the colleges to come together in order to get more revenue for each college. And the district role will be how to facilitate those conversations. And that is the reason we are saying, let's be open. Some conversation will be very difficult as we're going to go through the phase 2 part of the expenditure part. But at the end of the day, we are all in together. I mean, we are all facing the challenges right now to balance the budget. We all know that this challenge is not going to go away tomorrow, because that challenge is still happening for 23, 24, and 24, 25. As Dr. Jones have put it out there, you have to take those money out of those budgets because you just don't have it. Your expenditure side is already in balloon already, and you are trying to make those cuts. So we are here to facilitate the conversation, make sure that we arrive there so the 23, 24 colleges don't need to wait for FTEF from the district. They can figure it out on their own exactly what kind of FTEs they would like to generate at each college and collectively work together. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, CM.
Well,
Yeah, I had a couple of observations and maybe some clarifications. Dr. Jones, I think you were saying that we could do the 35 or the 45% vacant position freeze, and there wouldn't really be any impact. It was just really the fact that some of those positions wouldn't fill anyway. So I wanted to get clear on that. And then also, I noticed the book supplies and services line item. Last year we budgeted 22.3 million. We apparently spent 15.8, and now we're budgeting 23.3 or so. So I'm just wondering why that variance occurs and why we're budgeting that again. And then I think finally, on the debt service of the bonds, that's another line item where we budgeted, 2.3, spent 121, and I think one of the proposals is to have it at 2.5. Do we need that to be at 2.5? What's the interest rate? I presume that we're paying down some of these bonds. What's the interest rate on those bonds? Is that the right thing to do at this time? And then, yeah, I think those are my main points, but those all seem to be areas where could be other options for savings. Oh, and then the final thing is the fund balance. I think you had mentioned that you were reluctant to reduce the fund balance because it might at some point in the future have a negative ramifications if we were to go out to the bond markets. And it might have a negative impact on the rating that we would get. And I'm just wondering, is that in the plan for us to go to the bond markets anytime soon? And then also, at what point does it become problematic in terms of the bond rating? I thought 10% was our target fund balance, and we're well above that.
Yeah.
So that could be another
10%
opportunity
is,
for
10% is what's required by our board policy. It is not necessarily what is recommended, and quite honestly, given the costs of different things and inflation, other things, and the office is actually requesting and strongly advising districts to have 2 months of operating reserves, which is around 16% for the most part. And so that is what is in part informing that. The other thing that I would say, I'm not going to get into some of those details, but the other thing is with regard to the bond, we are currently needing to do a new issuance, and it is a present reality. And we have bond counsel and that we're working with right now, and we are being and they are going through and determining what our rating will be from Standard & Poor's, Moody, Fitch, and so that's happening like now. And so if we and they already had these financials, and so if we go and say, oh, here the data that we had given you previously is there was an adjustment or a mistake, and then also we show a substantial reduction in terms of our fund balance, that's going to not be very good. We're almost assuredly going to have a lower rating. If we just simply say, okay, there was an adjustment made, and the fund balance is strong, all of our fundamentals remain positive and strong, we're likely to even get a slight bump in our rating, but at a minimum, not a degradation of our rating, which is really, really going to make a difference for us moving forward, because that will cost us less in the future in terms of our expenses. So it's important.
Thank you.
And just to be clear, Lowell, we are planning to present to the board the beginning of October. We have to do what they call a POS, a preliminary offering statement. And because we're making this adjustment to the budget, we've already made a presentation to Moody's, to Fitch, and S&P. Now we're going to have to go back and revisit them again. And as Nathaniel said, we don't want to show that we're dipping into our reserves and then say, oh, by the way, we want you to improve our ratings. So we're trying to make the minimal impact as possible. And it seems as far away from the classroom as possible. So that is how we came up with the options 1 and options 2. And I did, like I said, add some other items that are there that I collected from the chat.
How about the books and supplies, that line item?
Well, number one, I would say that that's unaudited. We haven't closed the book, so I think that that's one of the differences. And while we have just sort of gone back into more fuller operations, we haven't been in full operations in terms of campuses being closed. So some of the utility costs are lower than they would be otherwise, and things like that. We also haven't done as much travel and other kinds of things for professional development. And so there's a number of things that explain why in previous years we've had books and supplies at one level and the actual expenditures being somewhat lower. But as we continue to open up and go back to more normal operations, those costs are going to be realized as well. So that's the answer there, sir.
So we're at 3:08. We're a little bit beyond our 2-hour point, but this is really an important discussion. So Chancellor Dr. Jones, I'll turn it over to you to let us know how you want to proceed.
Well, I was just going to answer a couple of questions that were in the chat, and I think it addresses kind of a thread that has been going through for a while. And this one came, I think, from Tashetta and from Brad about FTES, and are we really looking at ways to increase FTES? And I would say, yes, we are. When I get questions like that, when I know what we've been discussing at my level and people in the field, so to speak, the campuses don't know it, it gives me cause for concern. We have been addressing our FTES shortages in a number of ways, and I'll just go quickly through those. We've held a CTE summit with the career technical education. That's one of the threads that we're looking at. If you build it, they will come. If you get students on campus, and primarily that's through the career and technical education components, on our campus, they'll tend to take other classes when they're on campus. So that's one thread. We've had 2 meetings on that. We have a couple of initiatives that have been funded. We received $500,000 from the earmark. 400 of that is for specifically for our cybersecurity program. The other 100,000 is for other initiatives that may come up. And we've had at least 2 of them that I know of. The other one is through strategic partnerships. We just received $500,000 from PepsiCo. They're also interested in internships for our students. We also have a LAEP initiative, which is an initiative for students that have a career path to get into internships. We have yet to receive funding from the state on that. So that's another partnership. We have a charrette coming up on November the 10th, which is to invite the community into our campus. We're looking right now at Laney College for them to help us kind of finalize input for our enrollment management plan and our district strategic plan. Again, strategic initiatives. We're looking at housing. Right now we received each college received $110,000 to look at a feasibility study for housing, because we know that's an impediment for students coming is housing uncertainty. We've already addressed food uncertainty at the campuses by providing food banks and the like. And so we're doing a lot. I have asked Mark to pull together an annual plan because we don't know ourselves. That was recommended to get the word out of some of our successes, because, you know, like I said, people just don't know. There's a lot going on. And unless you're at some of those governance committees, it's hard to get the word out to everyone. So we're trying to address that with this annual report. But specifically to FTEF and FTES, that is why we need DMC, is to be reenacted, because that is the arm that does those things that Robert Brim talked about. They're the ones that say, hey, all colleges, let's sit down and talk about this. Hey, all colleges, let's look at this by discipline. At one time when I was here, Back to the Future, we had on Flex Day in the afternoon, all discipline meetings, all discipline. Everybody that was in clusters sometimes, because there's usually one person in a particular discipline. So we had clusters. And I don't know if you were here during that period, you know, that again, that was back in 2005, 6, 7, 8, where all of the ESL people got together and they would come up with strategies across the district and scheduling and course offerings and initiatives that they want to put forward or grants that they wanted to go forward. We haven't done that in a while. We need to do that. And people say, well, why aren't we? Why doesn't the district do that? There again, well, that takes a person at the district to be able to do that. So if we're going to do it, we have to do it collaboratively. It can't just be waiting for the district, like CM said, to say, okay, guys, this is what you need to do, because we can do that. You guys can do that yourselves. It's just a matter of we haven't defined it and we need to. So there's a lot going on. I know it's hard to keep up with everything. It's hard to get it disseminated out there to everyone, which is why we wanted to have this, so we can get your input. And I did capture it, but I think a lot of it is more strategic than something that we can do, with the exception of what you just brought up about books. We can look at that, and I did capture that and see what that is. That might be some savings in that area.
Okay. I want to go and share 2 additional slides, and then I'm done. So the other thing that I would want to share is looking at the importance of our FTS or enrollment vis-a-vis our funding. And so what you have here in terms of this graph, the blue line is our funded FTES. The orange line is what we actually earned. As you can see, over time, those lines have grown further and further apart, which means that we're funded at a much higher level than we are earning based on what we are producing in terms of FTS. Okay, why is that important? Well, here's why it's important. In 24-25, that year will be the last year that we receive COLA on top of our TCR. And that TCR will be the funding floor below which our revenues will not fall. However, given how our expenses has been growing, that's going to create a problem. If our expenses stay growing at the rate that they are, as soon as we are no longer receiving COLA on top of our TCR, there's an inflection point. And then
And I want to interrupt you a little bit, Dr. Jones, because I know you're looking at numbers. I look at potential. We have the potential within this district, as demonstrated by our fall enrollment, to make some corrections. This is the worst case scenario. If we keep at where we are, if we don't change, you're right. Our increases, our expenditures are going to increase. Step and column increases, cost of living increases, all of those kinds of things, but we won't be getting those funds from the state. However, if we make that correction on that blue line, that is what my aim is. And we're starting to do that now.
And this is exactly what you're referring to. And so as to being more strategic, these are strategies. And as you see, the first sort of category of strategies are exactly what the chancellor is talking about in terms of revenue strategy. What are different ways that we can produce additional revenues? And we need to begin looking at those kinds of things. And then we can look at also on the expense side, what are one-time expense reductions that we may want to explore? And then what are ongoing expense reductions that we need to explore?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
I'm done.
Thank you. I think that everybody is saying some of the same thing in a different way. And Brad, to your point of why would we cut classes? Because we are not making any money when we let a class go through with 8 students in it. I had a faculty member at one of the open sessions say, my class was on the cutting block. I had 8 students. And then they told me that it was going to be cut and I was able to increase it to 12. The zero line for, that's been established and people don't like it because it relates to a business model is 17.5. That's 30 students. That's not 12 students. That class was allowed to go at a deficit spending. So when you say we need to add more classes, we can't add more classes if we're having an average of 8 people per class, when we should be having 30.
35.
Well, I'm being generous here. 35 is, you're right, it's 35, but we've said, and faculty have said, and I've listened to them, 17.5 isn't, we can't do 17.5. So we reduce that and say 30. Okay, so we have to balance that. As a steward, the financial steward for this institution, that would be like you having credit card debt and you just keep putting your expenses on a credit card and you're making the minimum payment. You're never going to pay it off. And that's what the state is saying to us. You guys are doing this and you keep pushing it down the line like it's a credit card, but your credit card debt is getting out of hand. You'll never catch up. You'll never catch up. We did a projection and it showed that if we grow by 1%, it'll take us 39 years to make up that difference. Do you think the state's going to give us 39 years to make that up? I don't think so. They haven't even given us 5 years. They're saying it needs to be done now. So I just want to be Those are those hard discussions that CM talked about. When you start looking at the data, not looking at what you want it to be, but looking at what is realistic. And you're right, we are doing okay right now. We are making a turn from where we were last year in terms of enrollment. But can that be sustained over the next few years? I don't know. That's the crystal ball. But working together, I do think we can do it. I really do. I've seen it done in this district while I was here. I've seen that done. But we were all working together. We weren't pointing fingers. We weren't at odds with each other saying, why do the cuts? Because everybody was working to get the enrollment in. Everybody was working to say, hey, we got great faculty. We got great staff here. We care about you. That was the message that we need to get out to people if we want students to come, not the message that we're slashing classes. Who would want to come here if they hear that? I wouldn't. I don't think you would if you were a student. So we need to change how we market ourselves. And we are not bad. Nobody in this room is a bad person, I don't think, or you wouldn't be in education in the first place. Because when you're in education, you're always giving. And you're trying to pass it forward. So I want to end on that positive note rather than, saying that, we can't. Because we become a self-fulfilling prophecy when we say we can't. Your body does everything it can do. Those of you that are in psychology, to make sure that what you said, you fulfill that mission, whatever it is. So I don't want us to get into the mindset that we can't turn this around, because we can. We've done it before. For those of you that have been here more than 10 years, we have done this before. But we just have got to come together and to move forward. And we need to put the structures in place that allow us to move forward. And that doesn't mean always hiring somebody at the district office. I agree with you on that. But there are some gaps as identified in our functional map. So if you haven't looked at the functional map, it's out there on the web pages. Every college, it's out there. Went to the board in November of last year for approval. That is what we use as our guidepost, because we did that functional map without looking at dollars. We looked at functions. And that is where we start when we work with CM as we move forward to improve and to create those structures. And one of those is Dempsey. So, Leslie, last question before we close it up.
Yeah, I was
make
just
it positive, Leslie. Make it positive.
I am. I was just going to reinforce. I mean, it's in the chat. I just wanted you to. I mean, we have over 100 people here on a Friday afternoon who came and listened to this because they care, because they want to ask questions. And just because people are asking difficult questions does not mean they're not trying to be positive, right? We're trying to solve a problem. And yes, you are hearing frustration from folks about FTE allocations and those types of things, and concern when we hear these numbers of, oh, you only had 8 students, because many of our classrooms actually don't even hold 35, right? We have lab classes that don't hold 35. There are rooms in BCC that can't hold 35. We can do that if we're going to put everything as a lecture class online, perhaps, but that's not the strength of the Peralta district. Our strength is that we teach small classes, face-to-face, hands-on skills. So the students are transferring and are successful because they've had
I'm so glad you did. I'm still in this.
very close, instructions with their faculty that care, that say, hey, how come I haven't seen you? So I think it's really positive, but I do hope you are also listening to the concerns that we're really focused on this idea that because of decreased FTEF allocations, we couldn't even offer classes that would historically have filled, because we have that data from past years. I mean, yes, enrollments went down because of pandemic, but we have lots and lots of departments and I know Laney numbers better, but I can tell you, having worked with CTE for a long time, all across the colleges, those numbers are coming back up. But if we can't offer the classes, we can't increase the enrollments. And that's That's why you're hearing the frustration. So again, I would really hope that you take that 100 people were here, that people were actively in the chat. Please, save the chat, really look at it, because it is positive, because we're trying to solve the problem. If we didn't care, we wouldn't be here, right? And we are here.
Thank you.
So,
And you are here and you are present. And I appreciate that, because on a Friday afternoon, there's a lot of other things I'm sure all of us would rather be doing. But I want to thank all of you for being here. This absolutely, when I say this, I don't say it just because it's the right thing to say. I have a lived experience that we can change this in Peralta, because I was here in 10 years and I saw it. I saw us hit the bottom and laying people off. I saw us get off of warning, get fully accredited, and our FTF was on an upward trajectory. And we just have to do some of those things that you talked about. And it's not easy, but it can be done. It can be done. I've seen it. So thank you, Leslie. I appreciate that. And thank all of you for being here. And we are going to save the chat. We are going to capture it. We're going to put it in a menu of options. But it seemed like what I was hearing is far away from the classroom as possible. Let's look at our FTES, FTEF, look at where we are right now that census is over with, which we will, and then take all of those things into consideration. Some of them strategic, some of them are short-term. Okay. Any other questions? I said Leslie was the last one, so don't anybody raise their hand. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
We will continue this discussion. This is not going to be the last time. Okay. All right. Maybe not on a Friday at 4, though. All right.
Yes.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.